The mid-80s were a period of enormous change for Games Workshop. Interest in the company's distribution of Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop RPGs was waning, but the popularity of their newer ventures was beginning to skyrocket. Warhammer was only a couple of years old at this point, an emerging phenomenon remarkable for its use of proprietary miniatures, something unheard of for other game systems of the time. These models were produced by Citadel Miniatures, a production company founded in 1979 with funding from Games Workshop. By around 1985, they were largely keeping Games Workshop afloat. This set the stage for Citadel's founder, Brian Ansell, to buy Games Workshop out from under its founders, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, who were at the time finding more success with some of their other ventures. You might have heard of a little book series called Fighting Fantasy. Games Workshop's headquarters were moved from London to Nottingham, and the company reorganised to focus on the production of miniatures and games that centred around them. Ansell took the reins of the entire operation, making sweeping changes throughout the entire company, determined to make Warhammer a household name. Why am I explaining all of this corporate nonsense, you may ask? Part of Ansell's push towards creating a cohesive Warhammer brand was an emphasis on removing Games Workshop's association with Dungeons & Dragons by making the Warhammer world stand apart from its predecessor. Warhammer's world was incredibly Tolkien-esque, with all the expected elves, dwarves, orcs and goblins. And Ansell's solution to this was to create a truly original new race for his fantasy setting, something that really stood out and exemplified what made Warhammer unique. Ansell's solution was this. A lot of people don't even know that the Zote isn't unique to Warhammer 40k, and even there it was largely treated as a joke by the community right up until its reintroduction with Blackstone Fortress this year. Boy, that's a cool model. So obviously Ansell's Zote ploy didn't work out. Not that it particularly mattered considering GW's meteoric rise from there, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about some of Games Workshop's other senior designers' response to the Zote, another original race they felt would better set Warhammer apart from the crowd, the Fimir. Though calling them totally original is kind of a stretch since they're basically cribbed directly from this illustration of a Fomorian, dark counterparts to the legendary Celtic Tuatha De Danann by Alan Lee. The Fimir were promising. Mist-shrouded, one-eyed bog monsters with a complex relationship with the gods of chaos and a largely untapped Celtic aesthetic. They were exactly the sort of thing to ignite the imagination. Unfortunately, things took an instantaneous turn for the oops. The background written for the Fimir mentioned that they had a penchant for taking humans as slaves. Why do so many Warhammer factions practice slavery? Why do so many Warhammer factions I like practice slavery? Am I a bad person, or did they just write slavery into all the fun factions for some reason? As well as the inability to reproduce without human females. These two things together led to... I've seen some second-hand sources, who notably don't cite their own sources, suggest that this was intended as another connection to the Fimir's Celtic roots, referencing how fairies spirited women away to magically impregnate them in Irish folklore. And that definitely makes sense as a source for such a weird bit of lore. I haven't managed to track down the original source of the statement though, so take it with a grain of salt. What little support the Fimir have gotten over the years since has avoided mentioning the thing about human females to the point where at least one wiki questions if it's even canon at all anymore. I'd personally say no, especially with the emphasis on Fimir being matriarchal, based around a female ruler called the Miarg, whose single official model has an exceptionally silly bowl cut, and I love it a lot. But regardless of whether it is or isn't canon, the damage has already been done. Most conversations I've had about the Fimir have gone along the lines of, I've been looking at this Fimir model.
Oh yeah, the Fimir look great. Shame about the sex slave thing though.
And honestly, I think it could have been left as an unfortunate footnote in the history of the setting. Plenty of Warhammer factions have some weird and uncomfortable lore quietly forgotten as books and updates over the years have drowned them out. But the Fimir don't really get that, with very little updated lore coming out at all over the years. Which seems odd, right? At the beginning there was a big emphasis on the Fimir being Warhammer's most original race, and yet they didn't even receive a 40k counterpart, something that even the much ridiculed Zotes got, and still get. The only other Warhammer factions with no obvious 40k counterpart are Lizardmen and Skaven, both of which are kind of referenced, with the old ones and the Hrud respectively. The Hrud were more Skaven-y before, but then they got turned into whatever this is? Tomb Kings, they're robots now. Ogres and Halflings, welcome to the Imperial Guard, fuckos. Beastmen, stick a gun on a Zangor and call it Christmas. Christmas? What do I even mean by that? The problem was that, along with the regrettable lore implications, Fimir were just kind of abject ass on the battlefield. This wasn't the intention though, and stems from some incredibly bizarre internal miscommunication between the original designing of the Fimir and the actual models produced. Jez Goodwin, veteran designer and co-creator of the Fimir concept, produced a rather lovely prototype model for the range, which eventually had a limited release and, in true Jez Goodwin fashion, really holds up even 35 years on. This prototype was about the size of your average greenskin or bestigor, standing on a 25mm base, and the Fimir were given stats and points values to match this. When it came time to design the actual Fimir range for wide release, however, some wires were obviously crossed somewhere because Nick Bibby's official sculpts are huge, standing on 40mm bases. On a side note, my cat's nickname is Bibby, which isn't pertinent to the conversation, but it kinda makes it difficult to take Nick Bibby's name seriously. Sorry, Nick. The problems with this discrepancy between models and stats were twofold. The first was a question of logistics. These models were hefty chunks of lead, and they weren't cheap. Remember how I mentioned that their stat lines and points values were already written down based on the 25mm prototype? Because of this, you needed quite a lot of Fimir to have enough to actually play a game with them. And racking up that many would take some serious financial investment. If you manage to actually stump up the cash to fill your house with a veritable legion of enormous metal bog cyclopses, they just kind of weren't very good. The problem was that, being so big, Fimir were incredibly vulnerable to swarming by units of smaller models. For other big models, this vulnerability was usually offset by a suitably beefed up stat line, but again, Fimir were written with the stats of models half their size, and were pretty feeble even then. This made them basically impossible to keep alive, as they'd almost always be pitted against more than one model who probably had better stats than them anyway. Because of all these things, Fimir completely bombed. Their models didn't sell, they almost never appeared on the tabletop, and they were remembered almost exclusively as sex monsters. In fact, they didn't see any more model releases until Milton Bradley's HeroQuest board game in 1989, a kind of D&D light set in the Warhammer universe. 3 identical plastic Fimir came in the box, returned to their originally intended scale, as some of the monsters players could encounter. These little fellas are your best bet if you want to own an official Fimir model, since they turn up on eBay for around a $5 all the time. After this, it seemed that GW were completely done with the Fimir. Their original purpose of being an original race to set Warhammer apart from its predecessors basically irrelevant as the setting and its futuristic counterpart became worldwide phenomena. During this period, a cult following sprang up around the Fimir, however, and a contingent of people began to ask for their return. And they didn't get it for a full 23 years. All hope seemed lost for a glorious Fimir resurgence until, at the beginning of 2012, Forge World released a unit of 3 resin Fimir warriors. These models are absolutely gorgeous, once again standing the size of ogres but with the stats to match. Unfortunately, however, basically no new lore was released to accompany them, and the models stayed quietly tucked away in the monster section of the Forge World web store for years, basically unsupported with no real army of their own. Despite this, the Fimir must have survived the end times, because they received stats and very limited lore for Age of Sigmar. For whatever reason joining the Destruction Grand Alliance, home of greenskins, ogres and the like. Gone were the references to Fimir being discarded children of chaos seeking to restore the favour of their gods, but I guess thousands of years and at least 2 apocalypses could do that. Sad I can't play them as an ally for my Skaven though. 2016 saw the next release for the Fimir, as well as stirrings of a huge expansion to the Forge World force. The Fimir Archnoble, a perfect commander for Forge World's already released Fimir warriors, was released at the 2016 Age of Sigmar Open Day. It's absolutely my favourite model ever, the entire reason that I got so interested in the Fimir in the first place. The aforementioned Age of Sigmar Open Day had a few more surprises for Fimir fans, however. Some prototype sculpts for even more Fimir models were showcased, and some stats for at least one of those units, the Dirach Balefiend, were apparently released, though I haven't been able to track them down beyond mentions of it from the time. Among the other models showcased were an appropriately spooky Fimir wizard of some sort and something referred to as a Fimir mother, presumably a Mir. It just looked incredible. What I wouldn't give to get my hands on that prototype. Unfortunately, absolutely none of those models have been mentioned again to this day. We've had bigger gaps between Fimir releases, but further events lead me to believe that we probably won't be seeing them anytime soon. In November of last year, all the previously available Fimir, as well as the entire Tamarkan's Horde range of Nurgle units, quietly slipped into Last Chance to Buy before disappearing from Forge World entirely. I myself had somehow entirely missed the existence of the Fimir until last month, despite frequent trawls through the depths of the Forge World web store, and only managed to track down the ones I have through luck and eBay alerts, and a lot of money. A lot of money that I don't have. To this day, no more news about those models or any other Fimir releases for Age of Sigmar have appeared, so it's fairly safe to assume that the release of the Fimir Archnoble didn't revitalise the sales for the range in its short 3-year tenure. One wonders where the Fimir would be now were it not for all those early shenanigans. The Skaven have survived largely unchanged all the way to the Age of Sigmar and received consistent updates and support, and are probably our closest allegory to the Fimir, being largely original products of the mind of Jez Goodwin. Perhaps they'd be major players in the Mortal Realms today, with their own plastic, probably 25mm battalions, battle tomes and endless spells. But then I suppose we wouldn't have the Fimir as they are, a mysterious and tantalisingly scarce piece of Warhammer history. We certainly wouldn't have the Forge World models we did get. There is a little hope though. The Norska DLC for Total War Warhammer includes Fimir warriors as a unit, so at the very least we know they haven't been totally forgotten. That DLC released around a year before the Forge World Fimir culling those, so who knows where it will lead. Also, right around the time the Fimir were discontinued by Forge World, a new monster for the skirmish game Warcry appeared named the Fomorite Crusher. This fella seems to be at the very least based on the same Fomorians of Gaelic myth, with its single eye referencing King Baelor One Eye, just like the Fimir. The decision to give it a more reptilian face with beak-like lips suggests that a relationship with the Fimir was also intended by the designers, especially when you take into account the Ogreoid Myrmidon that released alongside it, which seems to be an ogre-like monstrosity, while the Fomoroid is its Fimir-like counterpart. My one here has been converted a bit to fit in with my Fimir models though. Regardless, I for one hope we at least get to see that one prototype Miog have an official release somewhere down the line, or at the very least they release the one they already have, specifically to me so I can own it. Thanks for watching the video. I haven't done anything like this, really, before. I did one scripted video once, and that is gone now, because it wasn't very good. But if you enjoyed this one, please like and subscribe, and do all the YouTube things, leave me a comment, tell me about your best friend in the comments. Maybe, if you want. That's something. Special thanks to Snipe and Web for appearing in the video, Longfang for providing his voice, and RHD Miniatures for capturing some Fimir footage for me, because my computer does not run Total War very well. I might do one of these again, who knows? You know what I'm like on YouTube, or maybe you don't, but bye.